A conspiracy to decapitate the Union. On the night of April 14, 1865, the air in Washington, D.C. was thick with the scent of victory and gunpowder. Just 5 days prior, Robert E. Lee had surrendered at Appomattox, effectively ending the most brutal conflict in American history. The capital, long a nervous garrison town, was now ablaze with celebratory light and relief. For 4 agonizing years, the nation had cleaved itself apart. But now, under the watchful, weary leadership of Abraham Lincoln, the Union was whole again. The president, tired but profoundly optimistic, sought a rare moment of levity. He and his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, were attending a performance of the comedy Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater. The presidential box, a makeshift lodge draped in red, white, and blue, was positioned strategically above the stage. It was a beacon of national triumph. Imagine a bomb blast at the White House, the simultaneous assassination of the Vice President and the Secretary of State, all while the President is shot in the head. This was the horror conceived not by foreign agents, but by American citizens. Lincoln's murder was merely the opening act of a coordinated plot, a conspiracy so audacious, so close to fruition, that had it fully succeeded, it would have plunged the United States back into chaos, potentially unraveling the hard-won victory of the Civil War and fundamentally altering the trajectory of American democracy. This is the story of the 4 hours on Good Friday when America was meant to lose its head. The unraveling hour. The applause was generous as the Lincolns settled into their seats shortly after 8 p.m. They were accompanied by Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée, Clara Harris. Outside the box, a single chair had been placed just inside the door, intended for the president's security detail, a city policeman named John Parker. Parker, unfortunately, was a man more dedicated to the comforts of the local saloon than the defense of the nation's leader. He had, by all accounts, left his post during the second intermission, likely joining the theater's coachman for a drink. The door was unguarded. At 10:15 p.m., in the quiet third act, a man slipped through the unlocked door to the box. He was John Wilkes Booth, perhaps the most famous and charismatic actor in America, a matinee idol from a celebrated theatrical dynasty. His public persona was one of romantic heroism. His private reality was that of a fanatical Confederate sympathizer, seething with a sense of historical grievance and committed to a desperate act of vengeance. Booth moved with the silent, practiced grace of a stage veteran. He had memorized the script of the play, knowing exactly when a laugh line would cover the noise of his action. He raised a Derringer pistol, a small, palm-sized, single-shot weapon, to the back of Abraham Lincoln's head and pulled the trigger. The sound, usually a dull clap, was amplified by the close quarters of the box. Major Rathbone instantly lunged, but Booth slashed him savagely across the arm with a Bowie knife, nearly severing the major's tendon. Booth, a man who lived for the dramatic flourish, then vaulted over the balustrade of the box, a dizzying 12-foot drop to the stage. His spur caught on a decorative flag, causing him to fall awkwardly, snapping the fibula bone in his left leg. Despite the searing pain, he rose, brandished the bloody knife, and, according to witnesses, yelled something that has been fiercely debated for 160 years. The most commonly cited line is "Sic Semper Tyrannis," the motto of the state of Virginia. The audience, initially paralyzed, registered the scene: the celebrated actor, the pistol shot, the bloody leap. Booth limped across the stage, past a stunned actress, and burst out the theater's back door, where his getaway horse, a bay mare, was waiting. A stagehand, realizing what had occurred, attempted to grab the reins, but Booth kicked the man away and galloped into the darkness. Within minutes, an army surgeon in the audience Dr. Charles Lale, reached the president. He immediately diagnosed the wound as fatal. The bullet had lodged behind Lincoln's right eye. The president, utterly still, was taken across the street to a modest boarding house, the Peterson House, where he was laid diagonally across a small, uncomfortable bed. The vigil had begun. In Target. While the nation's lifeblood was draining onto a pillow in the Peterson house, a second act of the conspiracy was unfolding just a few blocks away. The plan was not merely to kill the president, but to sever the entire head of the Union government. The primary co-conspirator, a man named Lewis Powell, was assigned the most difficult task: the assassination of Secretary of State William H. Seward. Seward was not merely the Secretary of State. He was Lincoln's right-hand man, the architect of much of the Union's foreign policy, and the powerful figure in the upcoming Reconstruction. Killing him would not only remove a key leader, but also signal an unprecedented level of anarchy. Seward, however, was already incapacitated. 9 days before, he had been thrown from his carriage and suffered a severe concussion, a broken jaw, and a broken arm. He lay bedridden in his home on Lafayette Square, his face encased in a complex splint that included a metal frame. Lewis Powell, a strapping, powerful former Confederate soldier, was a man of terrifying capability and quiet intensity. He approached the Seward residence at approximately the same time Booth was entering Ford's Theater. Powell was wearing an elegant suit and a slouch hat, and was carrying a package that supposedly contained medicine from Seward's doctor. He convinced the servant at the door, William Bell, to let him in. Bell was immediately suspicious, but felt powerless to stop the imposing figure. Powell claimed the medicine had to be personally administered. He bounded up the stairs. Seward's son, Assistant Secretary of State Frederick Seward, intercepted him. Powell shoved a revolver in Frederick's face and pulled the trigger. The pistol misfired. Powell didn't hesitate. He smashed the younger Seward over the head with the butt of the heavy pistol repeatedly. Frederick collapsed, his skull fractured and bleeding profusely. Powell then burst into William Seward's room. In the room were Seward's daughter, Fanny, and a nurse. Fanny shrieked as Powell, knife drawn, lunged toward the bed. He began to stab wildly at the Secretary of State, aiming for the neck. The heavy metal jaw splint, intended to aid Seward's recovery, inadvertently became his armor, deflecting the most deadly blows. Seward was stabbed in the face and chest multiple times, blood soaking the sheets, but the splint saved him from a throat cut. Fanny fought back, screaming for help. When another son, Augustus, and a wounded Major Rathbone, not the one from Ford's, but a resident of the house, rushed in, a terrible melee ensued. Powell fought like a beast, stabbing all 3 men. He was a whirlwind of violence. He slashed the nurse, too. Believing the Secretary of State dead, Powell retreated, fighting his way out of the house and onto the street. He escaped on horseback, dumping his knife and hat in a desperate bid to appear less conspicuous. The Seward house was a bloodbath, a scene of shocking brutality. 5 people were gravely wounded, and the Secretary of State lay barely alive. The missing target, and the cabinet in chaos. The final and crucial piece of the conspiracy was the murder of Vice President Andrew Johnson. The third co-conspirator was George Atzerodt, a German immigrant and carriage maker, a man completely unsuited for the dark, deadly task assigned to him. He was tasked with killing Johnson, who was staying at the Kirkwood House Hotel. The plan was for Atzerodt to secure a room above Johnson's, wait for the signal, and shoot the vice president. The reality was that Atzerodt had been drinking heavily for days. The weight of the impending violence, the moral horror, and his own lack of nerve crushed him. He secured the room, but he couldn't go through with it. Instead, he wandered the streets of Washington, drinking, getting drunk, and eventually throwing the weapons into a gutter before passing out at a hotel 15 miles from the Capitol. He had failed completely. It was this failure that saved the constitutional continuity of the United States. News traveled fast in the small, panicked city. Within the hour, the reality of the coordinated attack began to solidify. The scene shifted to the Peterson House, now the epicenter of the shattered government. Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton, a man of iron will and grim efficiency, arrived and immediately took control. Stanton was a military genius who had organized the Union's victory, and now, in the face of what appeared to be a coup d'etat, he became the de facto president. He ordered the doors locked, stationed soldiers, and began issuing orders with a speed and clarity that belied the horror of the room. He transformed the humble front parlor of the boarding house into a command center. Messages went out instantly via telegraph, orders to close the Capitol's borders, to set up roadblocks, and to begin the largest manhunt in American history. Stanton's immediate fear was that the assassination was not the end, but the beginning of a larger Confederate uprising or a planned assault by remaining Southern military units. He also had to manage the constitutional crisis. Lincoln was alive, but clearly dying. The president was in a coma. The Secretary of State was mutilated and near death. And the vice president was a complete unknown, an untested Tennessee Unionist whom many in the cabinet distrusted. Stanton's first key decision was to secure the succession. He sent an armed guard to fetch the shaken Andrew Johnson and bring him to safety, where he would be protected. Stanton was determined that no further attack would succeed.
The manhunt begins. As dawn broke on April 15, the president was still clinging to life. The military machine of the Union was now focused on hunting down the conspirators. Stanton had mobilized thousands of troops, police, and detectives. The faces and descriptions of Booth and Powell were plastered everywhere. Booth, the celebrity actor, was easier to trace. His flight path was relatively clear, across the Navy Yard Bridge and into southern Maryland, a region known for its strong Confederate sympathies and where he had friends who could aid him. He was joined by David Harold, a young man who had acted as a general aide and messenger for the conspirators. Harold's role was to guide the more famous but geographically ignorant Booth through the back roads of Maryland. Harold was also supposed to have waited for Atzerodt at the bridge, which explains how he knew Booth's route. The escape, however, was immediately complicated by Booth's broken leg. The pain was immense. Their first stop was the home of Dr. Samuel Mudd, a country physician who, despite having had a prior slight acquaintance with Booth, claimed to know nothing of the plot. Mudd splinted Booth's leg, allowing him to continue his journey on crutches. This decision, to help a man whose identity was instantly recognizable, would later seal Dr. Mudd's fate and make his name infamous in American history. It became the key point of contention in the conspiracy trial. Was Mudd an innocent country doctor or a crucial member of the treasonous plot? The fugitives continued south, hiding in the woods, relying on the secret Confederate network, the Confederate Underground Railway, to evade capture. It was a humiliating and painful journey for the once great actor, now a crippled, hunted killer. Meanwhile, in Washington, Lewis Powell was in a state of confused terror. He had fled the Seward home, dumping his hat and weapons, and had no idea where he was. He was an Alabama farm boy, lost in the confusing, grid-like streets of the capital city. He wandered for 3 days in the swamps and thickets of the city's outskirts, desperate, starving, and unable to make contact with any of his co-conspirators. On the night of April 17, completely lost and defeated, Powell did the unthinkable. He walked directly back to the boarding house of Mary Surratt, the conspirators' alleged meeting point. The Surratt house and the web of treason. The Surratt boarding house was a place of ill repute and feverish Confederate talk. Mary Surratt, a widow, and her son, John Surratt, Jr., were deeply entangled in the espionage network that ran between Richmond and Washington. It was here that Booth and his associates had often met to plot and drink. Stanton's men, following up on leads, had placed the Surratt house under surveillance. When Lewis Powell stumbled into the house, exhausted and covered in mud, he was immediately apprehended. He offered a clumsy, unbelievable story. He was a simple laborer hired by Mrs. Surratt to dig a gutter, and he had come to collect his wages. Stanton's detectives were not fooled. Powell's refined clothes, his strong, calloused hands, and his aggressive demeanor contradicted the story of a mild-mannered ditch digger. He was identified by William Bell, the Seward servant, and the trail of blood he had left in the Seward home. Mary Surratt, confronted with the captured assassin in her parlor, coolly denied ever having seen him. This brazen lie, however, was one of the key pieces of evidence that linked her directly to the conspiracy. She was arrested on the spot, becoming the first woman ever tried by the United States government for a major capital crime. With Powell and Surratt in custody, the full, shocking scale of the plot began to emerge. The plan was not just for a few lone assassins. It was a conspiracy designed to create political chaos, possibly to force a ceasefire with the South and a renegotiation of peace terms. Booth had not acted alone. He had acted as the leader of a cell of fanatics. The final standoff. The trail for Booth and Herold led across the Potomac River and into Virginia. They believed they were entering friendly territory, and for a short time they were right. They were hidden by Confederate sympathizers, their celebrity as the president's killer momentarily granting them a strange, perverse heroism among the defeated Southerners. On April 26th, the manhunt finally ended. Booth and Herold were cornered in a tobacco barn on the farm of Richard H. Garrett, near Port Royal, Virginia. The 16th New York Cavalry, led by Lieutenant Edward H. Doherty, surrounded the barn. Herold, a coward at heart, quickly surrendered, crawling out of the barn door with his hands up. Booth refused. He was wounded, exhausted, and trapped, but he was still the actor, determined to make a final, dramatic curtain call. "I will not be taken alive!" he shouted into the night. The cavalry unit threatened to burn the barn down. "Go ahead and burn us out!" he yelled back. "I'm gonna get my man!" referring to the officer he planned to shoot. The barn was set on fire. As the flames illuminated the interior, a sergeant named Boston Corbett, a deeply religious and eccentric man, saw Booth. Corbett, acting against direct orders to take Booth alive, raised his pistol and fired a single shot. The bullet struck him in the neck, shattering his spinal cord. The shot was not instantly fatal, but it paralyzed him from the neck down. The soldiers dragged Booth from the burning barn. He was laid out on the grass, unable to move, only able to speak in a choked whisper. In his final moments, the man who had brought a nation to his knees could only look at his hands. "Useless, useless," he whispered, before succumbing to his wound as the sun rose over Virginia. The body of John Wilkes Booth was secretly transported back to Washington, identified, and then disappeared. Stanton, fearing a cult of martyrdom, had ordered that the burial place be kept secret. The assassination plot at last was over, but the astonishing, brutal legal reckoning was about to begin. The true nature of the conspiracy and the questionable justice that followed would rock the foundations of American law for a century.